Hello, and welcome to Literary Notes, a podcast by the Washington Talking Book and Braille Library. I'm your producer, Nathan Ureta, and today's episode is a deep dive into the history of Seattle's waterways. As the city began to grow in the late 19th and early 20th century, developers altered the land and water of the area to promote commerce and transportation. David B. Williams and Jennifer Ott document these years in their book, Waterway, the story of Seattle's locks and ship canal. Jennifer Ott joins us to talk about the politicians who planned these waterways, the immigrant workers who built them, the engineering feats that made them possible, and much, much more. Library volunteer Martha Baskin conducts the interview. Here it is.
Jennifer Ott is Executive Director of HistoryLink and an environmental historian with a particular interest in Seattle's history of moving dirt, rerouting waterways and leveling hills. She's the author of Olmsted in Seattle, Creating a Park System for a Modern City, and co-author of Waterway, the story of Seattle's locks and ship canal, which we're going to talk about today. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me.
All right. Long ago, in the early 20th century, Seattle was a city with waterways and working waterfronts as far as the eye could see, but those waterways and waterfronts fell short when it came to a future based in manufacturing and shipping. Before we dive into the making of that future and the history of Seattle's locks and ship canal, could you paint a picture of what Seattle looked like in the early 20th century? What did it look like geographically? Who were the people who lived here? And for Native peoples, what challenges did they face with existing waterways?
Well, Seattle, for a city nearly surrounded by water, it's interesting how there were some very particular impediments that stymied movement. And so if you think of Seattle, downtown has the Elliott Bay on the west side and Lake Washington on the east side, both amazing waterways when you think of industry and city building, which is what the early non-native settlers were really thinking about. But the challenges there were that on the Elliott Bay side, there were tremendous tidal flats, thousands of acres of tidal flats. And the trick for building a city is that you need level land for industry adjacent to deep water where ships can come and go. And you also need a railroad connection so that you can reach the inside. And so, but what Seattle had prior to about the 19-teens is that there were the tide flats south of downtown, south of King Street, and then there was the river mouth, which had an estuary coming around the southern end of Elliott Bay, and then the deep water was right in the middle of the bay. So the only level land was where we know of Pioneer Square today. And then if you look a little farther afield, you have Lake Washington, which is an amazingly large, deep water body, but it is nearly inaccessible by large ships because the Duwamish River, which is its outlet, the Black River and the Duwamish River, they were challenging because they were shallow and they were a very gradual gradient slope. And so they had a lot of shoaling, they had a tidal influence, and so they were not reliable channels for getting ships in and out of Lake Washington. And on the northern end, where the ship canal is today, there were two pieces of land blocking the connection between saltwater and freshwater. One was a section of land where the Fremont Cut is today. There was a little creek there, but it was not for ships. And then at Montlake, it was an isthmus, not a cut. And so you had a solid piece of ground between Lake Washington and Lake Union. And so those things blocked the east-west movement between saltwater and freshwater. Interestingly, for Native folks, it was a different sort of geometry and a different calculation about what made a good waterway. They have a regional perspective where you're looking at deep interconnections all throughout the region, and they're maintained through travel on waterways via canoe, which is far more adapted to our local geography. And so there's two solutions that they come up for those challenges. One is that they can portage. They can cache canoes on one side of the spits of land or in the shallow areas. And then they also have river-going canoes that are much shallower draft. And so And they have trails. They have a trail system that goes throughout the region, so they can be interconnected that way.
Okay. And I want to go back to the impact on Native peoples a little later here as
Yes.
we go forward. But Thomas Meyer, a man named Mercer, there we go, Mercer, was the first to call for the joining of the lakes and Puget Sound in 1854. He and others had just established what was then the village of Seattle. And when he proposed the name Washington for the big waters that Native peoples used for the Duwamish and other waterways, and Union for the smaller lake, he noted the possibility, quote, of this little body of water sometime providing a connecting link uniting the larger lake and Puget Sound. What was his vision? What inspired him? Was he going against the tide, or did he simply recognize the need to connect the waterways?
He definitely was with his times and seeing a need. He was a teamster, and so he knew how difficult it was to move goods overland in this area. It was, the valley bottoms are marshy, the hilltops are covered in forests. So he can see right away that connecting Lake Washington with saltwater is going to be key to the economic development. And it's interesting that he doesn't necessarily call for the use of the Duwamish River and the Black River, because I think they're just such a problematic waterway. It's much easier to envision that there will be a canal connecting Lake Washington with the Puget Sound, because there's a historical precedent all across the eastern United States to build canals.
Right. The Army Corps of Engineers, of course, is instrumental. They organized a survey for military defense of the coast in 1867, which involved looking at Puget Sound as a possible site for a naval port. How important was this for ultimately constructing the ship canal?
It's a bit of a push-pull, because the folks who are local recognize that if there isn't a federal investment, it's going to be very challenging to complete this really big project. But the federal government sees Seattle as very much in the hinterland. We are in a very distant, isolated place from their perspective. And so they do send a board of engineers out from the Army Corps of Engineers to take a look a few times. And what they repeatedly decide is that, yes, Puget Sound is an amazing protected inland seaport, and that is it's a destination. It's a location where there is a military interest. And then Lake Washington and Lake Union offer fresh water. So they called it laying up in normal. That is when they stored naval ships. And to store them in fresh water is so much better, because you don't have as many shipworms. Well, you don't have any shipworms eating away at the wood. There's no tidal influence. It's much more protected water. But over, I think it's 3 times that the Board of Engineers consider creating the ship canal, they just decide that there are not enough people here to justify the investment. Like, there isn't enough of a momentum in economic development to really justify that investment in this region. Another place they looked at that I just think is fascinating, they looked at Sinclair Inlet, which is adjacent to today's Puget Sound Naval Shipyard in Bremerton. It's Silverdale's at the head of it. And they looked at building a dam there and making that a freshwater body, and as a laying up in normal kind of a port. And but they decided that wasn't worth the investment either. And so they eventually built Puget Sound Naval Shipyard, which is in protected waters, does have a saltwater surrounding it, but they make that work.
Interesting. But then by 1895, if I understood the timing here, Seattle had 2 partially funded canal projects, one which you and your co-author call a front for a tidelands fill scheme, and the other that would require lobbying to secure federal funding. Can you explain?
Sure. So there are lots of efforts to see how they move around the reticence of the federal government to get involved in developing the ship canal. And one of them is the scheme. Although I have to say, David and I looked at the records, and he doesn't seem to be scheming in the sense of really deceiving the investors, but it does appear that Eugene Semple, he was a former territorial governor, and he formed the Seattle Lake and Lake Washington Waterway Company. And the idea was to cut a canal through Beacon Hill, just north of where today's Spokane Street is. And it's a crazy idea. Beacon Hill is an enormous hill, and so there would have been multiple locks. It would have been incredibly disruptive. And it seems
And it was
ridiculous.
already a steep hillside.
Enormously steep hillside, yes. And so, but he did proceed, and the reason we think of it as a scheme to do tidelands fill is what was completed was the dredging of the east and west waterways, which those dredge spoils were used to fill for Harbor Island, and then also for part of the tidelands fill on the east side of Elliott Bay, that's now Soto, basically. And he also sluiced a lot of soil down from the hillside. That nice little cleft in the hill where the West Seattle Freeway and Columbian Way go up to Beacon Hill, that is the part that he sluiced down and filled the tidewaters with.
I can picture it, yeah.
Yeah, which creates made land. And so all of a sudden you have more level land. And so he can sell that land. And so that's why it feels a little bit like a scheme. The people that were supporting what they called the government canal, which would be the northern route, which is where it is today, were furious with Semple because he was getting investments and he was distracting things. And Congress started to say, you all can't decide which route you even want. Why on earth should we invest in one of them? Like, you need to sort things out before we're going to give you any significant funding. And so that was the battle through the 1890s was which location would it be built in?
Oh, right. And then we fast forward to 1909, and work on the ship canal finally began almost 50 years from the initial vision. What were the engineering challenges? You were already talking about them. What were the political challenges? Yeah.
So the engineering challenges were making decisions about what would be the actual mechanisms of the ship canal. Like, what would be the component parts that would make it work? And everything was a cost-benefit analysis sort of study. And so Hiram Chittenden, the Army Corps of Engineers engineer who was working out the plan, was also working at the same time on a plan for managing floodwaters in the Duwamish Green River Valley. That's the one extending south from Renton. And that's another very low slope river. When there's flooding, the water just sits in the valley afterwards. And the farmers are very frustrated by the river not behaving. And so they want intervention by the federal government to prevent flooding. And so Chittenden looks at the entire picture of all these water systems and sees how they can complement each other. And so, and then they also know that they need water to be able to operate the locks that will have to be built for the ship canal, because every time they fill that lock, it's an enormous outflow of water out of the lakes. And so what he settles upon is that Lake Washington would be lowered to the level of Lake Union, and they would achieve that by cutting the Montlake Cut, which is an opening in that isthmus. And so they start right away. That's the first thing they start with, although it takes forever. The cut is completed in about 1910, but it isn't open for operation until 1916. And so the lake stays at its level for a few years. But once it's lowered, that means that the outlet is no longer the Black River through Renton. The outlet is now the ship canal. So we've replumbed a waterway. And at the same time, they take the Cedar River, which comes out of the Cascade foothills and joins with the Black River at Renton. They turn it so it flows northward just a short distance and enters into Lake Washington. So we've moved two rivers out of the Green Duwamish River Valley, which is supposed to help with the flooding. Didn't really help, but it was a contributor to getting things squared up there for industry and farming. And so you have those two rivers. And then they raise Salmon Bay, which is on the westward side of the Fremont Cut, to be the same level as Lake Union. And it becomes a freshwater body. It had been a tidewater bay. And so that is achieved by building the dam at the locks. And so that dam that runs south from the two locks at Ballard is what is holding Salmon Bay up at the level of Lake Union. And so basically they've created a level plain where there had been two steps down from Lake Washington to Lake Union to Salmon Bay. And so they had considered putting a second lock at Montlake so that Lake Washington would not be disrupted, because it was extremely disruptive to lower the lake by 9 feet, an average of 9 feet. That moved the entire shoreline all the way around the lake. It dried up access people had to the water. And there was quite a bit of light industry on Lake Washington that was affected. But they decided that was worth it. And then also the flooding of the tideland in Salmon Bay was pretty disruptive. All the mills had to raise themselves up. So, but they decided that constructing and operating one locks was far preferable to operating two locks. And that probably was a good decision because it's expensive to run them.
You've raised a lot of points here, and I want to talk about, the what happens when you change from brackish to freshwater. But what I'm going to ask now, I think, is dams, dams and dams bursting. They often go with the territory, right, of any canal. Can you share an instance when dams did burst and the outcome?
It was so the dams that they were building during construction. There were cofferdams built at the Montlake Cut. So those are intentional earthen dams that keep the water out of a small area. And so they have a cofferdam at the east end and another one at the west end of the Montlake Cut. And that is because they're not ready to lower Lake Washington until they're ready for the canal to be operational. And so they dig a ditch, but they leave it dry. And so those are managed, and they are only broken once they're ready for it. And so that happens in 1916. But in 1914, on the Lake Union side, right by Fremont, there was a dam at the east end of the Fremont Cut as it was under construction. And it was a wooden dam. It was well built, but it wasn't meant to be a permanent structure. And it did give way in 1914. And the pictures are amazing. It shows it was just a gush, right? There's just massive wall of water that goes through. Luckily, there was not a lot of development nearby that was damaged. But the houseboats on Lake Union were all dropped to the lake bed because they were on the shoreline that was fairly gently sloped. And so you see all these pictures of the houseboats resting on the ground, and all the people that lived in them, their entire house drops down hits the ground. So I can only imagine how disruptive that was.
Oh, yikes.
Yeah, what a shock.
All right. But there were no lawsuits.
No.
Well,
I'm sure there were some, but no big ones.
Okay. Let's talk about concrete, the most widely used building material in the world. It doesn't often come up as a topic of conversation in an interview, but when it comes to building locks, concrete is fundamental. With what raw materials make up this versatile material? And could you talk about the gantries, the bridge-like overhead structures with a platform that allowed concrete to be moved from one point to another?
It's amazing. There are some wonderful photos of the locks under construction, and you really get a sense of the part that you see on the Ship Canal, on the Ballard locks today is just the tip of the iceberg. That underground there is an enormous infrastructure to the locks, and it's all made out of concrete. And so I'll make sure I get it right. It's sand and gravel and the cement itself and water until it cures. And those are all mixed together. And we are particularly lucky in Washington that the gravel that we mine out of various places for the Ship Canal, it was mined out of where the golf course in Lakewood, it just went out of my mind. It's a very famous golf course. I'll try and remember it. But there's the gravel that was left here from the glacial ages is really excellent gravel, which seems like such a funny thing to value, but it makes our concrete extremely strong. The particular size of the cobble and how it's all mixes together. And so it is remarkable when you go to the locks today and you see that concrete and how well it's stood up. We're going on 109 years now. And the concrete is faring very well. There have been some challenges, as always, with the moving parts of the locks, but the actual structure is amazingly solid.
Yeah. And the gantries? Anything to say about the
cranes
gantries?
are amazing. There are numerous places in Seattle history where gantry cranes made construction projects possible. And the way they work is that they are, I think of them almost like a tower base that is anchored to the ground, usually with 4 legs, and they're often on rails. And then they have long arms that reach out over the construction site. And so the way that facilitates construction is that as the large construction area builds up, the gantry crane can be moved from side to side, and materials can be moved out and in along the long arm that stretches out over the construction site. So it's a very versatile, mobile kind of crane that, because it has 4 legs, it can kind of straddle construction underneath it also. So it's very flexible and remarkably useful.
Had it already been in use in construction?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it wasn't
Yep,
something
it was a very well-known strategy.
Right.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay. Of course, neither concrete or construction can happen without workers. Chinese workers were initially involved, but then forced out by a growing racism. What changed from one decade to another, 1860s to 1883? Because I believe a Chinese-owned firm was among the contractors initially.
One of our earliest Chinese immigrants was Chung Ching Hock, and he started the Huachong Company with a couple business partners. And his story, he's a remarkable life story. But he was exactly the right person at exactly the right time. He was well connected, and he was a very good businessman. And he knew that he could bring in workers from China that were needed to carry out the capital improvement projects we wanted to do to build a city. You need to have enough able-bodied, primarily men at that time, workers that were willing to do very difficult jobs, very physically demanding jobs. And you just needed critical mass, and until you had that critical mass of people, you could not build a city. And so the immigrant laborers that came in from China provided that sort of boots on the ground, shovels in the dirt kind of labor. But there's a tension. There's always a latent racism. There is never a time in Seattle's early history where that isn't an issue. But it was people were more interested in building a city than in necessarily excluding anyone. However, as you get more white men who are coming into town and wanting to work, although there's still, I do not believe that the Seattle could have continued to build at the pace it did in the 1860s, 1870s, and early 1880s without the Chinese immigrant labor. There just are not enough people here. They're an essential part of the community along with the indigenous people. But what you start to see along the West Coast is as more white workers are here, the racism that's always present in American history against Asian Americans rears its head. Labor unions, this is not a particularly great era for workers banding together. Instead, there's a lot of division within the working community by racial lines. And so you see in the early 1880s a rise in that tension and a more militancy to it, more of a desire to push people out, white folks wanting to push Chinese people out. And so it's interesting, right around the Ship Canal, you see that pivot. In 1883, 84-ish, there is an advertisement in the paper. It's very open that the Chinese immigrants are working on the Ship Canal. They are digging that first section where the Montlake cut. Okay. It was called the ditch. It was the log ditch. Mm-hmm. It's a very narrow trough that they dug between Union Bay and Portage Bay on Lake Washington, Lake Union. And they had a very tiny lock system that they could use to build up the water and then rush the logs through that they want to get to the sawmill on Lake Union. That is very clearly, we can document the Chinese laborers that worked on that. But about a year later, the work begins on the Fremont cut. And we are no longer able to document who did that work. We can implicitly figure out that it most likely was Chinese workers. But at that point, the sentiment had become so negative that people were hiding who they were hiring or not being as open about who they were hiring. And so there isn't documentation of it. And in 1886, we have the Chinese expulsion in Seattle. And that is when the white mob forcefully pushes Chinese people out of the city. Not all of them, but enough of them that it really dampens the Chinese community and also the economic development of the city.
And what happened to the contractor, the fellow who had so much experience, the Chinese-owned
Oh, Chung Ching Hawk.
Chong?
So it's interesting because there was, as often happens, a difference between how white Seattleites treated the business class of Chinese immigrants and the worker class. And you see this again with Japanese immigrants. There's a very big difference between how the business owning class is treated and the rules for immigration versus the worker class. And so Chung Ching Hawk and Chin Ki Hee and a number of other business owners are protected from the expulsion, and they continue to operate in Seattle. It's just that it's much harder because they are not able to bring in as many laborers because of the Chinese Exclusion Act that had been passed in 1882.
Okay. And so then who were the other workers? There's you have some anecdotes about some Swede who came forward, that would be par for the course of, but they came from all over the world. These were the engineers, some who had worked on the Panama Canal, I believe. What jobs were they doing, and what can you tell us?
So we were so lucky at the National Archives in Sandpoint. There are records. There's a card for each worker that worked on the construction of the ship Canal, and then worked on it when it was operational. And we see patterns like you see in a lot of Seattle in the early 20th century, that there's a lot of Scandinavians coming in, and they're working in these jobs. And then engineers, like you said, from the East Coast, the Army Corps of Engineers brings in people that are working on the project, and they're primarily white folks. That's the records that we were able to find. That appears to be predominantly the case. And they are working for both the contractors who the government contracts with to build the locks, and then also Army Corps of Engineers. Those are the ones we have the cards on. So we don't have a lot of information about the workers that were actually operating the steam shovels and the cement mixing and all of that.
Okay. The breaching of the Montlake Cut in 1916 was a major feat of engineering and a major cause for celebration. Hundreds of thousands gathered at the grand opening. What was involved, and what cargo began to pass through the lock? What began to change about what products were available and moving through all these wonderful waterways?
So the pictures from the opening of the Montlake Cut in 1916, I think it was August, are just absolutely astonishing. They're at the Museum of History and Industry, and they show how they breached the cofferdam and let the water just gush in. But what makes them humorous is that there are people in the path of the water. And over the course of 3 or 4 shots, you see the people running out of the way. Those are the good old days when OSHA didn't apply. But I always think it's interesting that what they did is they breached the western cofferdam first so that they could let the waters from Lake Union in. So that's the lower level. And then they breached the Lake Washington side, because then it was less of a gush of water, which I think I, not being an engineer, would not have thought of. And then one of the things that we were surprised about is when we were working on the book is that the mantra and the rationale for building the locks was to, from the beginning, all the way back to Thomas Mercer, is there are riches, natural resources riches on the interior, logging, or logs and coal mines and farm produce. And so the rationale that is often used in the lead up to the construction of the locks in the canal are that you need to be able to get those goods out of Lake Washington and out of Lake Union, out to saltwater. And that you have, with the opening of the locks, you would have 100 miles of freshwater shoreline that would be opened up to industrial uses. And there were, like, a steel mill was being promoted, and there was shipbuilding and all those things. And very much on a global transoceanic scale is what they're thinking of. They're not thinking of local trade. They're thinking big city building, be the Pittsburgh of the West kind of trade. And but what happens over the 63 years that it takes, as often does in Seattle, a long time to build something like this, the equation changes. And really, they've logged out most of the lands right around the lake that would have benefited from water transport. And the coal mines have built an entire railroad system that goes through the Duwamish River Valley, so they no longer need the lake travel to get the coal out. And most of the industry is concentrated in Seattle in the 19 teens and 1920s on Harbor Island and the Duwamish Waterway, which is the straightening of the Duwamish River. And so instead, you do get industrial development. Lake Union, I always think of it as being like elbows. But as soon as the locks open in 1916 and then officially in 1917, the first cargoes through are coal and lumber, logs, rafts of logs, but they're not going out of the lakes. They're going into the lakes. They're coming in for use for the coal comes in to power gas plants and other industrial uses of coal. And the logs are coming into the sawmills on Salmon Bay that have been built out in the interim. And so it's interesting. It serves the purpose for the cargo that they thought would be moving through it, but it's the opposite direction than they thought. And over time, that would sand and gravel for cement plants and materials for asphalt plants. Those would be a big part of the cargo moving through the locks. But really, it's logs coming in that is one of the big industrial uses for much of the first few decades.
Interesting. Because there was a new transportation route, immense changes. There were boat builders, machine shops, the first Boeing seaplane factory. It just kind of kept expanding and expanding.
It did. It was sort of, it's fun to look at maps to see how it filled in. And there were railroads built around the outer edge. And so they were able to move things around along the lakeshore. But you get little nodes of activity. One is around the Fisherman's Terminal that opens up in Salmon Bay. And that is a wonderful facility, public facility. It's Port of Seattle, that really serves the fishing fleet in terms of having some place to berth their ships, because fishing vessels were having to be beached a lot of the times because there was nowhere to tie them up in the winter or in the off season. And so, but the lovely thing that happens is a whole ecosystem that supports that fishing fleet. You see the machine shops and the engine works and the boiler works and all those sorts of things develop around the terminal. And so that becomes a little node. And then you have the tugboats and the cargo handling for the Alaska trade. There's a lot of barging that goes up to Alaska, still does today. That develops a little community of interconnected businesses. This is at risk now because it's becoming so expensive to operate along the shoreline in the urban area, and there's other pressures for access to that ship canal. And if you start to kind of chip away at that interconnected community, they're not cooperative, but they do cooperate. And so I worry. I watch the activity that's going on now. And you want to keep critical mass. And then in Lake Union, what you start to see is small boat manufacturing and marinas and a real boom of recreational vessels. But also all throughout, there are sawmills and fish processing and all sorts of light industry like that. And then out on Lake Washington, there is the Lake Washington, Lake Washington Shipyard in Kirkland that would evolve until World War II. And they're building enormous ocean-going ships there. And then you have Boeing on the southern end, and you have Sandpoint Naval Station. So you have all these different uses. There's a large creosoting plant and another sawmill where the Seahawks training facility is today. Okay. And so it's interesting how it really did industrialize those shorelines.
And then maybe that leads me on to this big one here. So let's move on to the environmental and the cultural costs. On the environmental side, first, there were steep costs. Marshlands were drained. Salmon were forced to find new migration routes. When the lakes were lowered and replumbed, Salmon Bay suffered the most environmental consequences. From what I understand, before 1916, the bay was a habitat of brackish water, tides that raised and lowered the water level, and an ever-changing shoreline. How was this beneficial to critters and plants and seagrass? And what happens when brackish water becomes fresh water?
It is remarkable. I sometimes talk about the audacity of engineers, that things that you might think would be impossible to imagine, they imagine, and then they make it happen. And so if you think about one of the ways I would describe the overall effect of the ship canal is a simplification. What had been a very meandering shoreline, tidal areas, and organic spaces became armored spaces that were very geometric, and they were simplified. But the saltwater, freshwater, if you think of the estuary function of those tideland areas, and so the outlet for Lake Union was through what's now the Fremont Cut. There was a creek there, but there was also the drainage from the surrounding Magnolia and Ballard neighborhood areas. And so you had this lovely little nursery area of varied levels of salinity, and you would have the cattail marshes and the eelgrass and all of those plant communities that would have operated in that intertidal zone or existed in that intertidal zone. And so they took that and replaced it with a freshwater, which can be remarkably diverse and wonderful too. But it's those edge habitats that often are just so incredibly rich with the diversity of species that we lost. And then we also, the other impact that's interesting that is invisible but really significant even today is that to facilitate the operation of the locks, you need a lot of water. And so the dam is managed and the lake levels are managed based on having more water in the summer and less water in the winter. And that is the opposite of the natural cycles. And so the shoreline, wherever it did survive, so like think of Anderson Bay right near Seward Park, that's a natural shoreline that survived. But the problem is that native species of plants need that other cycle, the reverse. And so it is very challenging for cattails and tule and those sorts of things to grow in that altered landscape. And so even places where the natural landscape would have survived or could have survived, where it isn't armored with cement, seawalls and that sort of thing, or bulkheads, you still have a very challenging landscape for those native species to survive and thrive. And so you have a simplification is the biggest way I can say it, is that it just, there's also the introduction of dock structures all around the lakes. And that is overwater coverage, which makes the area shaded, which means that there's less primary production of the smallest critters that then feed the food chain. And also salmon do not like to go under overwater structures. And so if you think about it, it's already stressful for salmon to be negotiating this industrial landscape, but then they have to go out and around and they can't stay in that near shore environment that they like. They prefer to be in the shallow water. And so we're making an already difficult environment more stressful and more energy consuming for migrating salmon. And so it has a cumulative effect on how the wildlife are doing.
I wasn't aware that salmon would not go under a dock.
They don't like to. No,
Oh,
there's no food because there's no sunlight, and then also there's critters, the predators. So that's on the central waterfront. That is why there are glass blocks in the sidewalk, because that lets light through adjacent to the seawall, and that draws the salmon along the shoreline, so they don't have the stress of going out and around the piers.
Exactly.
It's pretty cool.
And yet, to this day, salmon are deeply challenged. I mean, the challenge of our salmon population is only increasing.
Yes, it is challenging. I find a little bit of hopefulness in it, though, when you watch the water resource inventory areas. There are a lot of those are the watershed-focused agencies that work on watershed protection and salmon rehabilitation, and the tribes, of course, are deeply involved in those. And even though the big picture is very overwhelming, and I can't imagine what it's like to be a salmon trying to migrate through this area, the hopeful thing I see is that there are lots of things that are being done around the edges. There are lots of opportunities to restore small bits of habitat, build chains of habitat for the salmon. And the tribes are doing that. The public agencies are doing that. There's lots of conservation groups. They're all working together. And it's it's very hopeful to see the things. The Snohomish River
Yes.
Delta, there are amazing things happening there.
Fabulous. All right. That gives me hope. All
Yes,
right.
it
That
does.
gives, yes,
Yeah,
yes.
hang on to that.
Okay, I'll hang on to that one. So let's move on to you write that what was once a diverse landscape rimmed by wetland habitat and defined by constant change was now a placid body of water that changed imperceptibly on a daily scale. Could this ecological changes, could these have been avoided if the project had been done differently? Do you think they would have been done differently if it had started today?
That's interesting because I think about this a lot because it is easy to look back in the past and say, oh, I wouldn't do that. That's terrible. That's thoughtless. And, the cultural impacts of all the environmental change, the tribal communities here had, thousands of years of relationship with the landscape and how it worked and worked with it and relied upon the natural resources that this, the bounty of this region. And if once the lakes were simplified and operated differently as more of a plumbing system than a natural ecosystem, the tribes lost that. They also lost the Black River. We all lost the Black River, but the cultural significance of the Black River, because the river dried up when the lake was lowered. And that's a salmon run that's lost, and also all of the plant materials, and then the community that gathers there. That's a deep winter villages all along that river. And all of that posed a challenge for the tribes. And so we look back and we think, well, I wouldn't have done that. But we could decide today to undo it. It would be insanely expensive. But I like to pay attention to the fact that I am still benefiting from that change. And we're making a decision to continue to operate it that way. And so it is interesting to look at how could we have done it differently? Would the investment in a second locks at the Montlake Cut so that the Lake Washington would not have been lowered by 9 feet? Would that, when you put different costs into the calculator and you decide what your benefit is, and you're weighing that out, would we weigh it differently when we look at the cultural consequences, those costs being integrated into the equation? I hope we would. I think we've gotten a little bit better at this with our environmental impact statement process, the NEPA and SEPA. But I also know that there's a certain amount of city building that goes on and city operating. And that I struggle with figuring out how they could have done it in a way that wouldn't have been detrimental to the environment and to the cultural communities, the tribes particularly. But I hope we would have mitigated better for it. We would have looked for every opportunity to soften the impact. And I think that work is being done now, but it is so complicated that I think it's hard to do. And I don't have a dock on Lake Washington. Who am I necessarily to say you shouldn't have a dock on Lake Washington? That's hard on the fish.
Right.
And so I struggle with that quite a bit of I am part of the equation. And what am I implicitly agreeing is worth the cost?
Yeah.
It's a challenge.
And yet the cultural cost, the loss to the Duwamish and the lake people, their native name I won't try to pronounce, was just massive. I mean, villages were destroyed. They lost the Black River.
Mm-hmm.
And to this day, the Duwamish is a Superfund site.
Mm-hmm.
And it's been almost 30 years, I believe. I used to talk with the head of the Duwamish River Cleanup Coalition, B.J. Cummings.
Yes.
She was such a dynamo, as is Pauline Lopez to this day. But that's people in South Park, they still try to fish in the Duwamish, much to their detriment because its toxins are pervasive.
But it is interesting. I'm actually working on a project right now for some interpretive signage in Centennial Park, and one of them is about the salmon net pen that the Muckleshoot Indian tribe and the Suquamish Indian tribe operate with the Port of Seattle. And it is a way to mitigate those impacts and ensure that the salmon populations remain for wildlife and for people. And so they hatch the salmon in Keita Creek Hatchery. They truck them and then barge them to the net pen, and that's where they acclimate them to saltwater and increase their survival rates and all of that. And they're seeing it's working. There 1 million juvenile salmon were released this year. I mean, that's insane, the number of fish. And so the Muckleshoot, you can go and watch the fishery from the First Avenue South Bridge. It's amazing to watch. And so it is surviving. The trick now is to make sure it thrives and to make sure that it's safe for people. Those migratory fish are safer than the ones that actually live in the river. I think they suggest people not eat the crab that are in that estuary area. But we can continue to work toward that and ensuring that the cleanup continues. But it is, and then with climate change unfolding, that's going to have new impacts. And so, I just hope that we are extremely thoughtful with where are the best investments, where can we have the most impact on ensuring the integrity of the ecosystem and the cultural access that's necessary.
For sure. Good stuff here. Is there anything else that you'd like to share about this monumental book?
Let's see. I have to be sure and shout out for David Williams. He was my co-author. I'm sure lots of people who are listening are familiar with that book or with his work. And what I loved about working on the project with David is that he brings his geology background, and that sort of landscape view is a very... it brought me a better understanding of our entire region and how it all works together and how does it work here? Like, I always love learning how things work, and it makes me have a deeper connection to the place to understand how it works. And that carries over also to the economic workings. When we talked with the Ballard Locks Army Corps of Engineers staff, and we learned that one of the challenges that they have is the locks in the United States are funded through an equation that includes how much cargo is moved through them. So when coal and Alaska cargo and lumber and logs were coming through the ship canal, that was working pretty well. It was
the volume was there.
The volume was there, yes, exactly. And then in the 50s, you start to see a shift to more recreational boats. And you see over the 60s and 70s, less industry on the lakes and more recreational use. And so we have, if not the busiest, one of the busiest locks in the United States. But there's hardly any cargo coming through. Even fish, which is now processed primarily at open sea, not brought into Seattle to be processed. Or if it is, it's brought into Smith Cove. And so you have fishing vessels, but they're not full of cargo anymore when they come through the locks to get back to the terminal. And so how do you, in the federal government's funding world, everything is consistency, right? Like uniform across the country. And so how do you fund the locks adequately for its maintenance when there isn't the tonnage passing through that would fund more money coming to the locks? And so I love to go watch the ships at the locks and the vessels, any vessel that goes through there. But I do get a little pang for them when I see that it's mostly recreational vessels, because they get to use it freely, just like any other vessel, but they don't add a tick mark to the funding column. So it's an interesting conundrum that it's vital to our economy, but how do you quantify that in a way?
Right, and I'm somewhat hesitant to mention, but then under now the current political system, under the current Trump administration, what are there more challenges that they're going to have to rise up?
Exactly.
More challenges to the funding. Yeah.
And especially when it is 109 years old. They've been doing work since we wrote the book. There's been a lot of projects undertaken, and the things have been updated. But it's, there's water involved, and there's lots of moving parts. So there's always construction and improvements needed. And you worry that because it's a somewhat invisible service that it provides, I don't think people really understand the economics of it necessarily, that you worry that people won't know what could be lost until it's lost.
Indeed. Well, really, my pleasure. Really enjoyed talking with you.
Thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Jennifer.
Waterway, the story of Seattle's Lock and Ship Canal, is available in our catalog as an audiobook with the class ID DBC 15770. It will also be available in Braille with the class ID BRW 08916. We'll let you know in a later episode when that Braille version is available for download. If you have any questions or comments about the library, or to see if you qualify for our services, visit WTBBL.org or call us Monday through Friday from 8:30 a.m. to 5 p.m. at 206-615-0400 or toll free at 800-542-0866. This episode of Literary Notes is a production of the Washington Talking Book and Braille Library based in Seattle, Washington. I'm your producer, Nathan Ureta. Thanks for listening.